is not just Earth Day, but it's the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. That in mind, for many African Americans, this day is still unfamiliar. And for many white-led environmental organizations, we are a blind spot to their organizing and to their activities to build bridges of connection and partnership and true collaboration. Can you speak a little bit as to the implications and significance? Why should Black folk care about an Earth Day? And what are some of the things that you see that we can be doing to connect our daily lived experience to the themes that Earth Day panels tend to kind of focus on?
Good afternoon, everybody. Reverend Austria here. Greetings to my brothers and sisters and everybody on this webinar today. So, yeah, we're celebrating Earth Day. And when I think about celebrate, I'm thinking that this is something good. This is something that I ought to engage in. And so Earth Day is just an opportunity for us to celebrate and show our love and support for the environment. And that's what it really is in a nutshell, just showing our love and support for environmental protection on this particular day. And so I think I want to start by saying that, celebrating the environment and taking care of the environment really is not a new phenomenon to Black folks. While we seem to have taken somewhat of a sideline view at this moment, there are folks, our ancestors and folks before us who were really trailblazers when it came to lifting up and elevating environmental concerns. I'm thinking about back in the civil rights time when Dr. Martin Luther King was working on some environmental issues with folks down in Memphis and doing some strikes and protests and things around some really sad work conditions for folks in that area. This is back in like 1968, 1970, that time, 1967 rather. And even here in North Carolina, I remember years ago, the fight for folks in rural areas in eastern North Carolina around hogs and the injustices that were happening to folks in those rural communities. We have always been doing this work. We may not have named it as such, but we've always been doing some of this work. And so I think right now in this moment, what I'm seeing is that the church just has not taken her role as a trailblazer to continue in the movement. So I also want to say that historically, the Black church has been the place where information has been distributed. And so I remember as a little girl, I'm not that old, but I remember as a little girl, the church was where Grandma and them got all the information. So Grandma and them, they got everything they needed from the church leaders, from the pastor, the deacons. We knew about politicians through the church. We knew where food was available through the church. We got everything we needed. It was almost like our news station, to be able to go to church, be around folks who were like-minded, get information that we needed, and to go back into our respective communities, our respective homes. And so the Black church in particular, has always been a source of information, has always been a place where we could gather and get what we need. And so over the years, I always say, I've been able to dodge and weave my way through to arrive at a place where I'm a little more comfortable than Grandma and them were back in the day. And so in my dodging and weaving, what I have to remember is that I can't forget where I came from, and I can't forget the struggles of Grandma and them and Auntie and them and Uncle and them. I have to remember that these folks really struggled in the trenches, paving the way for me to be able to even dodge my weave and sit at a table with anybody of privilege and power at this moment in my life. And so I always think of myself as more a trench worker. I'm not from academia, so I don't have all the accolades that others may have, and that's okay. but I'm more of a person who's been in the trenches with people, working with people, dealing with struggle, and also trying to be a leader that leads by example. So let me give you some examples of some of the things in environmental justice and in respect to Earth Day, and then I'm gonna bring it back to Earth Day and pass it on to the next speaker. So, during my pastor time, I really found that we were having some struggles in the Black church, and particularly in my local rural congregation of mostly older and middle-aged Black folks, understanding the significance of our relationship with God and the earth and other humans. And so over time, we had to just really struggle through some issues of being able to relate to participating actively with the land. And because I had a congregation that was mostly older folks, a lot of them came from sharecropping. They had folks that they remember in their bloodline who were enslaved folks in these United States. And so we just really had to go through a time of healing and a time of focus on slavery and what that has done to Black folks in these United States. And so through a lot of prayer, a lot of going back into Genesis, talking about being good stewards of the earth and all the things, we eventually came to a place where my congregation of older Black folks, mostly men, were like, look, I get it now. I really needed to have that time to focus on the struggles of my ancestors. So now I can come back to a place of enjoying the land and understanding that this is how I'm going to survive. And so, we, of course, built raised bed gardens, started doing all the things. But one of the things what I'd like to hope to give to you today is that there are practical ways within our church, within our home, within our communities that we can begin to enjoy the land again, that we can begin to heal the environment again, that we can begin to enjoy these things. We just started recycling. I'm like, look at us. We don't even recycle. Can we just start doing something? Can we stop buying bottled water and do something differently? Can we start composting our food? Can we start getting our hands into the dirt? And so we just started doing some practical things in our congregation. I believe that my liberation is truly tied into what I do with the environment, with the land. I do not believe that I can truly be free unless I am doing and being a good steward of the environment. I believe that I can't live, my children can't live. Eventually, hopefully, I have grandchildren. I don't believe that I can thrive in this on this planet if I'm not taking care of the environment in some way, form, or fashion. And that is small things that I do at my home, the ways that I live my life, and where I spend my money. And so I think that the church has always been a leader in this movement. I still believe that we have what we need because God has already given those tools to us to be good stewards. And so I believe that over time, the church has dodged and weaved her way to a place and has forgotten about some of the struggle of our ancestors. And so when we tap into that, into that ancestral memory that we have, it's all within us. When we start having more conversations with leaders in our community, and in particular with Native folks, in our communities. They're in your community, they're in mine too, so don't say you ain't got none. We do. We have folks in our community who have this knowledge. And when we start slowing down, as COVID-19 has made us do, when we start slowing down, start opening up our windows, going outside and realizing that our liberation, our freedom, our right to breathe and be on this planet is tied up in how we treat the planet, then we can start shifting that dynamic, and we can start coming back to a place where we can be truly the people that God, my grandma always used to say, I want to be somebody that God is looking for in these last and evil days. We've always been living in last and evil days, but I want to be somebody that God is looking for in such a time as this. And so I believe I'll leave it right there, but I just want to say that this is a time of celebration. Today
Yeah.
is a day of celebration. Today is a day to take some time, get in the dirt, do some, plant some seeds and watch them grow. That today is a day to say, yes, I support the environmental movements. I support our environment. I'm going to take some small practical steps in my own personal life to do things differently so that this planet can last and last and last for many more generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Austria, for that opening statement there. You touched on so much. We're going to get back to some of the practical things before we leave, ways that different churches and individuals can observe. You made me think about the ball of plastic bags under the sink that's been there since I was a little boy. Never thought about it like reusing, but in the framework of and a more expansive idea around environmentalism and around this day, Earth Day, Big Mama and them were honoring the environment long before many of the terms perhaps even were lifted up. And toward that end, I'd love for you, Reverend Smith, and I think you and Dr. Henderson might do a two-step here, but there's a presentation that you have to really lay foundation around terminology, speaking of terms, and giving a comment and a shared understanding on some of what this movement has been and what it is today. I want to turn it over to you, Reverend Smith, to share. And then after you, Dean Kenny, I'd love to come to you because I'm wrestling and curious about the theological implications. I mean, Reverend Austria talked about there's somebody trying to call you. Answer the phone or mute the line. But Reverend Austria talked about some of the practical things. But I got a hunch, Doc Kenny, that the way that we read scripture and the way we understand God has interplay with some of what we are seeing or what we're not seeing in our churches. So I'd love to engage your wisdom around the theological piece here as well. Reverend Kenny, Reverend Smith, I'm sorry, won't you start and then we'll go to Dr. Kenny.
Absolutely, Doc. Doc Henderson and I have this joint presentation, and we'll see if we can pull it up. As it's coming up, I think it's important for us to understand. We've touched on this 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and what does that mean for our people in particular? One of the things that I always say when church folks ask me, what does this environmental movement thing have to do with me? And I always tell us in no uncertain terms, when we really talk about the environment, it's about three things: land, air, and water. And without two of those three things, you will die, right? You can only hold your breath for so long without breathing. You can only go so long without water. And the last time I checked, they're not making more land anywhere. And for Black folks that think that they're going to build a colony for you and me on the moon or on Mars, well, you keep thinking about that. So we need to be real and practical. And so Dr. Henderson and I, along with Dr. Carroll, had really come together and coined this term a little over a year or two ago, Black, Green, and Traumatized, and really looking at the intersectionality of environmental justice and trauma as it relates, and mental health trauma as it relates to Black folks, because oftentimes we don't really associate environmental degradation with mental trauma. But if we really look at things such as Hurricane Katrina, as we look at the Flint water crises, the truth of the matter is, even if we look at violence as an environmental factor, whether we're talking about violence in Oakland, if we're talking about Ferguson, if we're talking about Baltimore, whatever it is, there is trauma associated with where we live and the environments where we live. This COVID-19 piece has brought back full circle the issue of food justice. And so we're talking about today, this Earth Day, about how do we cultivate food justice in the era of COVID-19, because we do understand that the food supply and the food system has been challenged. But the truth is, it was challenged before, long before COVID-19 came into being. But the truth is, we're not paying attention, or we weren't paying attention at the levels that we probably needed to be. And what does that mean? And so if we go to the next slide, I just want to highlight something very quickly. The pandemic is impacting global food systems and disrupting regional agricultural supply chains and posing risk to households. You know, the last couple of days, there's been, and the last couple of weeks, there's been all kind of information. COVID-19 has impacted major food suppliers, major food corporations, ConAgra, as well as Kraft, the biggest of which, the Smithfield plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, I think it is, or Sioux Falls, Iowa, has 760 reported cases. They had to shut down the plant. And there have been at least 10 states with meat packing facilities that have had to shut down because they've had infected workers. And one of the brothers, they had a brother on TV last night, and he was saying that for personal protective equipment, PPE, he said in the meat packing plant, when the outbreak came, they said, well, just cover your face with a hairnet. And so we understand, you know what that means and who those frontline workers are. Oftentimes, Black folks, people of color, and the poor, working class. And what does that mean? And so we've seen the pictures of farmers having to dump 50 million pounds of produce and dairy every month. And they say that the food banks, they can't get enough to the food banks. Their biggest clients are restaurants and school cafeterias, but they don't really have the capacity to get the stuff there fast enough. And so what does it mean? It means that the people in our communities, the people in our churches, Dr. Brown, that you've been talking about, that the Black Church Food Security Network has to support, are not having the access to those things. So if we go to the next slide, Dr. Henderson, if you want to jump in real quick.
No, please continue. I'm loving this.
Very quickly, the residual impact on school meals. The Food and Agricultural Association of the United Nations says that school closures means the disruption or shutdown of school meal programs, which are often the only source of regular meals available for vulnerable and at-risk children. I'm gonna stop there for a minute. Dr. Henderson and I have on these sweatshirts for one of our programs, our Voices Against Violence program, that deals with at-risk youth. And it's an after-school program that really deals with violence with young people. We feed the kids after school. And the first month or so back in the fall, when we were starting with the kids, I was like, man, I'm a big dude, man. I weigh 300 pounds, man. And these kids eat more than me. What I realized is that was the only meal that a lot of our kids were getting. And so when food supply chains are disrupted, it's not as simple as the school closes. It reverberates, Dr. Brown, through the lifeline of our Black community. And I think we need to understand that. If we go to the next slide very quickly, Dr. Brown, you talked about understanding what food and environmental justice. We have some quick definitions. I want to run through these very quickly. Food justice is communities exercising the right to grow, sell, and exist healthy food. Healthy food is nutritious, affordable, and culturally appropriate. That means that if it's not affordable, if it's not nutritious, and if it's not culturally appropriate, it doesn't work. Food security simply means when all people at all times have access. And we see in COVID-19, not everybody's having access. We see the long lines that are existing at food banks, at churches like ours, where lines are going around the block, in grocery stores. Food sovereignty is really the right to control the food that comes into your community by growing, by producing, by selling, distributing. That is important. Environmental stewardship, and this is where we get messed up. Environmental stewardship is about the responsible behavior and the protection of the environment through conservation practices. But environmental justice really looks at the fair treatment and the meaningful involvement of people regardless of race, color, or natural origin. And that's where we often fall down. The justice part of the environment is where the traditional environmental movement and the traditional food movement often leaves the Black church and Black people, Black communities in general behind. Let's go to the next slide very quickly. Food security among African Americans. The food insecurity rate among African American households is double than that of non-white, non-Hispanic households. An estimated 1 in 5 African American households is food insecure. Those numbers are skyrocketing during COVID-19. This is data that was put together, you know, a year ago. So imagine where it is right now. Next slide, please. While the 105 counties in 2015 with the majority of African American population represents only 3% of all U.S. counties, 92% of African American majority counties fall into the top 10% of counties with the highest rates of food insecurity. That is staggering. And again, these are data, this is data from 2015, data from 2017 from Feeding America. Think about where we are right now in this, during this pandemic. Next slide, please. Dr. Henderson, you want to jump in real quick?
Yeah, where I came to know the brethren, and good afternoon to everyone. The fellowship that we came about because I had a grant with the United States Department of Agriculture, in which I had proposed to get veterans involved in urban agriculture more extensively. And during the course of that research, I came across the term with the Adjutant General of the National Guard Reserve in West Virginia. He told me about a program they were running there called, what the term was agritherapy, that they were using with their wounded warriors. And I hadn't heard of agritherapy before. And the more I did the investigation on it, it showed where there was gathering evidence and a body of knowledge that showed that agriculture was very effective in helping veterans with PTSD. And so we decided to try to join those efforts together. And in the midst of that, when I met Pastor Smith, when we first did the Black, Green, and Traumatized in Oakland, what came to the realization was PTSD wasn't a military concern only. It wasn't just the people who had served in our militaries, but through his Voices for Violence program, we had a chance to see. I mean, there it's Columbine. We're living in the post-Columbine era. Going to school is a challenge in a way that it wasn't when we were going to school. Being in church after Charleston brings even another level of trauma to that act of worship that we all engage in. But coming through this pandemic, we're going to have a population that has been traumatized just from going through this experience. No one has seen this. And so where we come in is hopefully presenting some options, some ways that the Black church can look at going forward, and not what I call the 21st century, but the third millennium, thinking that's beyond just the next 100 years, the kind of Black Panther kind of thinking that we saw in Wakanda, where we're solving problems that are beyond the reach and scope of our understanding at the moment.
Hey, man, can we go to the next slide? So one of the things that we've been talking about, how we deal with this trauma, Dr. Henderson has talked about immediate community responses. The first thing that we should really be talking about in our churches is food access and recovery mapping. What does that mean? Simply, you should really look at how people in your congregations, as well as within your immediate community, how they can access or recover food, right? Donated food or whatever, within a 3-mile radius. Looking at 5 and 10 miles, that may not be practical, especially for folks that have transportation issues, that may live in food deserts, that may be homeless or whatever. But really look at that food access mapping. You should be able to get that and do that through local food banks, church networks, denominational networks, really looking at how food access, who's feeding, What we did at McGee Avenue Baptist Church is when this thing hit, we were already serving hot meals 3 days a week. What we've tried to do, at least for the next few months, is we've increased that where we're serving 5 meals a day. So people need to know how they can access that food and the map and get the information out. Don't take things for granted, because not everybody has access. Not everybody's online. Not everybody has, the proper technology. So you need to be able to have some guerrilla tactics too. Somebody needs to post some stuff in the neighborhoods like we used to do in the old school. The next thing that we need to talk about, and these are intermediate and long-term solutions, we need to start talking about urban farming and community gardening as workforce investment and workforce development. Growing your own food locally, and really training brothers and sisters. When we talk about Sister Siobhan being a graduate of Tuskegee, and we think about some of the great A&M universities of our antiquity, Florida A&M, Prairie View, and places like that, agricultural and mechanical universities. See, we discarded a lot of that stuff because we believe some of the lies that we have been sold by the host culture, that stuff is Bama, it's backwoods, it's ghetto. How the hell have we made farming and science, the science of agriculture and the art of farming, ghetto? It's money there for folks that's into that, but it's also life-sustaining practice. So we need to think about how congregations get into congregation-supported agriculture, where churches say that we're going to be able to, at least in part, help to feed ourselves and feed our communities. If they can't do that, we should really think about backyard garden programs, backyard ministries, and what we do with Food, Faith, and Justice. Even if you ain't got a backyard, if you ain't got nothing but a balcony, we'll get you some seeds, we'll get you some pots and some planters, and you can plant you some collard greens and turnip greens, some nutritional value to at least offset some of the things that you need. We need to think about bringing our resources together in our churches, and how do we think about cooperative markets and really generating our own farmers markets, right. The great work of places like Black Church Food Security Network, and how do we engage in worker-owned collectives in our community to keep our dollars and our resources in. And that's kind of where we are. We have a quote from Fannie Lou Hamer, I think is on the next slide, very, very quickly. You can skip that one, go to the end. Fannie Lou Hamer says, if you give a hungry man food, he'll eat it. If you give him land, he will grow his own food. And I think that we need to think about Fannie Lou Hamer also as one of the great sheroes of the movement. We always talk about her disrupting of the Democratic Convention in '64, but she was far more than that. She was an activist, a food justice person that came from sharecropping backgrounds, and she understood the value of what it meant to be both or Black, green, and traumatized. So Dr. Brown, I know that's a small microcosm of where we are, but we wanted to lift that up for you today. And whatever else and questions we have, we'll go from there.
Awesome. Whoa, if that's a small microcosm, we got some studying and learning to do. That was rich, Reverend Smith. Thank you, Dr. Henderson, for that. You tied so much in there. Siobhan, if you could just think about where Reverend Smith ended off around some of those immediate responses, particularly as it relates to the Black church. We'll come to you in a moment. But Dr. Kinney, would love to get your thoughts here, because this is a Black church huddle. Now, we already had one held during this webinar, and I thought we're getting a little bit closer now. We get the rubber's hitting the road now. We got one held already.
And it wasn't me.
It's in the Bible, Doc.
Yeah. Kenny, how would you urge us and invite us to think about this theologically? There's stuff to do with our hands. We'll have a long list there. But many times we can stumble or have blank spaces around what do we do theologically with environmentalism, climate change, and the like. I know Virginia Union's done so much. So, Doc, please bless us with your thoughts on this.
Well, first of all, just thank you so much. for inviting me to this moment. I am very grateful. And several of you I've been working with over the years as we have instituted this in our curriculum, and even have had an annual conference to talk about some of these things. And some of you have been the guests who have guided us and certainly have enlarged my own understanding. In addition, for years being a dean, now still teaching, trying to teach, I've pastored. And out of this, one of the first things, Heber, the last time that we talked, we began to move towards some things. And I heard Reverend Smith, one of the first things we did, we found out what land around us was for sale. Just purchased 4 acres of land. We don't, we haven't used it yet, but we own it now.
I know that's right.
What the possibilities are, and it just grew out of that, some of those discussions. But as you mentioned, and I hear my sister talk about the things that are being done, and I'm learning from you all. But I think as one who's been pastoring and teaching, that we've got to, in some ways, transform the theological framework of how the Black church has begun to think. Discipleship in the Black church is really about decolonization. No, literally, if we're gonna be discipled, we've got to be decolonized. And what I just want to say, the more orthodox and evangelical the Black church becomes, the more it strays away from the foundations that has empowered it through history to do the thing in spite of the circumstances that they've been forced to engage. So at some point, for me, this theological piece is absolutely critical. Where you all have these hands-on, how do I help the Black church begin to understand that concerns for our environmental justice is not a group or an act, it's fundamental to our faith, and that caring for creation is foundational to authentic worship. You can't glorify God and destroy the gift of creation. And that's the first thing I think is critical to see, and I don't want to take too long. But in the colonized consciousness of the Western world creates an ontological gradation that puts creation beneath humanity. That is, it views everything with a hierarchy of beings. And you got to recognize first that we've got to recognize there's a certain culture on top. Then you get down, and then you get down to Black people, and you got to realize they even view the earth as beneath humanity. Whenever you see something that is ontologically inferior and you don't see them as a mutual reciprocal partner in a created event, you do not have the same ethical obligation to those persons. So the end result is you objectify what is beneath you, commodify it so that you can use it as an instrument for your own self-promotion and your own gain. So I got something today from one of my friends, and it said something like this: you're asking us to die for your economic gain. And if I can say it again, Brother Smith, and the response was, hell no, our ancestors already did that.
Yes, sir.
But I don't think we can help understand how we think of this. And regrettably, the Black church is being seduced into trying to promote itself within the hierarchy. And you end up with like prosperity and things like that, rather than being the liberating presence that collapses the hierarchy, and rather than changing your position within the hierarchy. And fundamental to our Black faith was an affirmation of the earth. It's when you read African scholars, and they went to Africa and said we were polytheistic and all of this, and we accepted that. An African scholar I once read years ago talked about, we are the most radical monotheists on the face of the earth. Because we believe in God so much, there's nothing you can touch in creation where you're not touching God.
Wow.
God we serve is diffused through creation. So I've got to recognize God in the tree, God in the soil, just like God in you. The real tragedy is, as we kind of embrace this hierarchy, We more and more are learning how to objectify each other and creation for the purposes of self-promotion. And we have got to speak in another way that in a very real sense, we might even run the risk of folks saying that we're panentheistic or something because we assign such intrinsic worth and dignity to the earth that when I touch the soil, I'm touching God. Yes, when I hug a tree, I'm glorifying God. And anytime I appropriate anything in creation, I've got to thank what I appropriate for giving themselves to me. Now, I always point out, any talk of liberation ought to talk about creation. If we can begin to even recognize that we were a 6-day creation, that the earth was God's gracious gift to us before God formed us. Now, I'm not talking about some literal interpretation of Genesis, but to understand that God graced us with the earth. And the minute we were formed, God said, take care of it. In both stories, which are hundreds of years apart, and I'm not talking about science, I'm talking about the deeper revelation of God revealed in the creative act. When God created us, the first commandment was not don't eat of a tree of knowledge. That was a negative prohibition. The first commandment was be fruitful and multiply. And the second is like unto it, I give you the responsibility to be the steward of the earth. I gave it to you before you got here, and your job is to take care of it. In the first story chronologically, which appears second in the series in the Bible, it says, I put you in the garden to cultivate it and guard it. And whenever God puts you anywhere, your purpose for existence is to make sure there's more life after you got there than there was when you went there. And I'm failing if I'm not engendering flourishing. I challenge even pastors who burn up congregations, where our attitude is, I use it for me, then I move on to get a better. That's that manifest destiny burnout syndrome that we as a people have to engage and powerfully with word and theology, collapse the hierarchy, realize the earth is a gift, and accept our responsibility. Then you can see why the intersections of what we're talking about for food justice, environmental justice, and even the victimization of people, because the people being victimized are in the hierarchy, the earth is in the hierarchy, and I use it all to promote me. And we're being tutored as to how to be positioned to join the self-promotion rather than how to be liberated from it. That's, we can go into great detail into that, but there is a theological challenge that we are facing right now. And in a very real sense, folk will say to me, don't bring that Africological, Afrocentric stuff up into the church. No, my question to you is, why have you left it? And look at the consequences for your community. Look at the consequences. The stuff that you call an old fogey, backward, irreligious is the very stuff that is now you aren't honoring, and it's destroying your community.
That's right.
So,
my Lord.
That's my comment.
But you're going to make me register for an MBA program all over again. Can I just come sit on your porch for a little while and you just do that? Can you share, and Siobhan, I'm coming right to you in a moment. There are a lot of people watching this right now, Dean, and there's already been requests that we do this again and just have you just do that thing you do and just roll. But can you share for the people who are watching, you talk about that form of theology that disconnects, that separates, that puts us in hierarchy.
Yes.
And you even made passing mention of how that can show up in our Black church spaces.
Yes.
Do you mind giving more word there around what should we be listening for to differentiate the theology that you're inviting us to lean into,
Yeah.
and the theology that is crippling and poisonous for the average layperson that's sitting in the pew, or to the average preacher or pastor who's trying to grow in this thing? What should
Yeah.
we be listening for?
Well, you be listening to certain things. I always point out that the snake, which for me represents that aspect of a free moral universe which invites your participation in thought or behavior in that which is alien to God's intent, desire, decree, and design for your life and for creation. In the beginning, I don't care, I've looked at hundreds of creation myths, and I don't mean lies, I'm talking about stories. All of them have a period. In the beginning, everything was together, that we were whole. Even a scientist will tell you nothing in creation exists in isolation, because once it enters into isolation, it enters into death. It's interesting that the Hebrew word for when you do this, you will surely die is separation. Now, look, here's where we were. We got like this. What has been institutionalized as a divine design is no longer this, but this. Somebody on top, somebody on the bottom. Look, what? A big lie. Men over women. Come on. That's a lie. That's not what God did. That's the consequence of getting separated from God.
Yeah.
Now, you get separated from your true self. He tells you a lie that you're not in the image of God. So we go to church to shout when somebody tells us we're a wretch or a worm, which means that we're now, the disruption of the snake has become normative for our theology, and that's why I call it snakeology. And we go to church and teach what the snake has spoken or did as the design of God. So the separation of men and women is not God's design. It was a consequence of moving away from God. Same thing with races, same thing with nature. For me, there are 4 levels of separation. You're separated from God, you're separated from your true self. You're taught to hate your own body. You're taught to make your own sexuality something evil. And you really got to understand, if your body is hate, and you're particularly hated if your body is black. So therefore, black becomes coterminous with ugly. And we'll spend billions of dollars trying to be beautiful based upon somebody else's standard. Now, so you get separated from your true self, right? We get separated from each other. Because now the very thing that caused me to rejoice because you were a gift to me, now I'm complaining about you and war with you. But the final thing is, remember in the end where it says there that you begin to war with nature. In the design, you were in harmony with nature, and nature just produced and flowed, and you flowed. Then in the act of separation, you warred with nature. Rather than reconnecting nature, guess what our theology did? We're above nature. And then you end up with a theory of domination rather than stewardship. And this stuff is still being taught in the church. You're no good. Conquer the earth. And here's the real thing. God is above you rather than God is with you. Even to the degree, and that's why Jesus represents the true God and overcomes the lie of the snake, because you stop worshiping a God who is above you and you discover Emmanuel, a God who is with you, and a God who is so low down that when you put your hands in the dirt, you're touching God. So all 4 levels of separation have become normative. We need to get back to God, back to our true selves, back to our relationships, and then back to Mother Earth. And that's where the healing is. And all we want Jesus to do is to free us from our sin and give us favor so we can have more Babylonian trinkets. When do we reconnect? When does the healing occur? And we just came out of Easter, and we will celebrate his resurrection and then go right back to our graves. And so this is the challenge. This is where I am. I'm confessing to you. You make me think as a theologian, and you've got to teach me some of these things that we're doing, even in the country church that I pastor. But one thing, right away, we were strapped for resources. But 4 acres of land became available next to us, and we found a way to buy that land. And can I just offer my testimony? We were already paying, had a note on a part of the church that we had to do again, and we were going to end up with 2 notes. And folks said, "Ain't no way we can do it, Doc. You're going to kill us. We don't kill." I said, "No, but do you realize never mind, I don't want to get into detail. If we're just faithful." But can I tell you what? We had 2 notes. The bank called us. And so he said, there's a program that for churches, we can set up something for you. And we're going to combine the note and get you at a lower rate. And our payment for both pieces of property became less than the payment we were paying for the. So guess what? Y'all can say it's financial acumen. I say, thank you, Jesus. Hallelujah. But in any event, it's just a simple thing. And our plan was this summer, even for our vacation Bible school, rather than doing the normal stuff, that all of the kids were going to go out and put their hands in the dirt, and we were going to plant seeds and do some box gardens, if nothing else. Can I just say this? One of the sad things is, when I went to this church several years ago, everybody in there was a farmer. I don't have a single one right now.
Wow.
When they died, the kids moved to the city, sold the land to developers, little or nothing. And so one of the things that we decided to do, I think Brother Michael Smith said it, man. If you can beat your hand, I'm just got some land. Nothing else I got, maybe I'll have a farmer will come and say, look, I need that. I can do something with that. Hallelujah. And of course, we've been with Heber and Morris, we're even talking about how we might be able to grow it and then have take it into the urban area with Patricia Gould-Champ.
Yes.
Have a farmer's market right there with healthy food. That's what we were talking about and exploring. That's enough.
Awesome. Listen, Lord have mercy. You're dropping jewels, as we say, Dean, and just thank you, Dr. Kenny, for your wisdom and insight. So much of where you ended is where Siobhan Terrell and her work and our work with the Black Church Food Security Network attempts to build. Siobhan, please give word to whatever's on your heart, but specifically as it relates to the work of the Black Church Food Security Network, even right now in the middle of COVID-19 and all that's going on.
Yes. First off, want to start with that I am on a panel with so many powerhouses. I text Pastor Brown. I was like, "Oh, I feel a little set up. I should have got at the doctor." But I took my notes. I am inspired so much by you all's work. And I want to speak about the work of the Black Church Food Security Network. But before I go into that, I want to raise a quote by Van Jones, who is the CNN commentator. And he said on one of his talks that the coronavirus is a pandemic on top of so many other epidemics in the Black community. And so many of those epidemics were already addressed, right? Food insecurity, spiritual devastation, and all of that is wrapped up in like what we call food apartheid. And food apartheid is the systemic destruction of Black self-determination to control our food and our food system. So the Black Church Food Security Network, what we do is we are rooted so much in our ancestral work of reconnecting back to our heritage and what is already ours. And we look to our ancestors for guidance because food apartheid, food insecurity are not new phenomena that just happened in the 21st century under Trump presidency. This has been happening as long as America has been an exception and as long as Black people has been on this country. But as long as Black people has been in this country. So one group that I want to raise is Mother and Father Divine. And Mother and Father Divine, we share so many similarities to them from the experiences of what is happening right now as it relates to this current pandemic, this looming economic recession, depression, everything that Mother and Father Divine had experienced during their movement largely. So in upstate New York, during the Great Depression, around like 1920 to 1929, they was building a community-based food system, and they was using what they had in their hand, their assets in their community, to leverage that to make a larger impact. So they bought farmland in upstate New York to grow produce that they transported to inner city New York, that they sold and that they sold in their restaurants, as well as they distributed to their community. So largely the work that they was doing is they was doing a lot of cooperative economics and doing a lot of resource sharing. And then that is what we aim to do as a network, a Black Church Food Security Network, is we are a coalition of churches that's using our collective assets to make sure that our communities are being fed throughout crisis, because it's always going to be one crisis after another, right? So right now we're calling this crisis COVID-19 or the Rona or coronavirus, right? But next week we probably might call this crisis Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane whoever, and then it might be rising sea levels, right? But so we are looking at the assets that we have available as the Black church community and quantifying those assets so we can leverage that to make impact. So we can leverage that to make sure our communities are fed. So we can leverage that to make sure when another crisis happens, we have our church vans rolling, taking our people right from that epicenter. So we have 3 major programs, and our first program is Operation Higher Ground, where we partner with churches to establish agricultural-based projects, such as community gardens, as well as if a church has land, we link them with farmers, and beginner farmers who don't have access to land but have that passion and that rigor and want to cultivate the soil to grow fresh food. And our second major program is the Soil to Sanctuary Market. And the Soil to Sanctuary Market is where we transform dining halls, we transform multi-purpose rooms, we transform parking lots, and we transform them into a farmer's market, where we come and we spotlight Black farmers within that neighborhood, within that area, by giving them a niche market to sell their produce in. Because a lot of the farmers that we work with, and a lot of Black farmers, frankly, they sell their produce through farmers markets. And a lot of their produce isn't being sold to giant Whole Food, those larger grocery store chains. So what we are doing is we are giving our farmers and our community a direct market to sell their produce to our community. As well as we spotlight different Black-owned businesses. So different Black-owned, like food-related businesses, we give them a market as well at our Soil Sanctuary Market to come and sell their produce. And our last program is that I kind of spoke of briefly is our Black Church Census. And the Black Church Census is basically what I mentioned before, is like quantifying church assets so we can strategize to make impacts in our community. And one of the programs that we had just launched is the DIY series. So we are equipping people with the knowledge and the tools to grow their own food. Because a lot of people feel like growing your own food, I have to have a degree in agriculture. I should have took some type of soil science class. And we are saying like, nope, it's not even that deep. Only thing you got to do is just have a water bottle, cut that with some scissors to cut a hole in it, and some seeds. And then you're already a grower. And we're starting with there. So that's what we do. We start where people are. We start where our community is. And we make it fun and energizing for people to start growing their own food and showing them and showing us, right? Because I am an attendee of that call and I'm learning with everyone else. And it's showing us that we are reconnecting back to our heritage and our DNA.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much, Siobhan. And the whole chat box plus all the panelists want to make sure that you know that you are just as dynamite as anybody else on the panel. We thank God for the genius reflected through your sharing as well. We got a few more minutes, family. Good gracious, that time has moved so fast. So if you have a question for any of our panelists, we have eyes trained on the chat box right now, and we invite you to go ahead and please post your question. But you raised, as you're doing that, Siobhan, you raised, I'm grateful for this as well, 2 different ancestors have come up so far, really 3 so far. Let me make sure I'm counting it right. We had Father and Mother Divine came up in the course of this conversation. Fannie Lou Hamer, Reverend Smith and Doc Henderson brought up Fannie Lou Hamer in the course of this conversation. I mentioned, or did I mention Reverend Vernon Johns? I did in the very beginning, that today is his birthday. And we don't have time, but if you've not seen the Vernon Johns story, if you want like a quick way to just get a basic introduction to Vernon Johns and why he was so important as preacher, academician, and farmer, living at the intersection of so many of those gifts, the Vernon Johns story is a great program you can watch. You can find it pretty much anywhere these days. Vernon Johns was played by James Earl Jones. And so go check out that documentary. But what I love about this Black Church Huddle is that in the lifting up of those names, we are demonstrating a way that our worldview is often distinct from some others who only see themselves as individuals. And here, just in the process of a conversation, by naming these names, we are also naming ourselves into a continuum, a larger community. Hebrews 13:1, the great cloud of witnesses of one day that we pray to be a part of. Questions that we have from our panelists, for our panelists rather, where are the programs and how can we get more information? Siobhan, you mentioned a couple of programs and a couple of people have asked how can they plug into that?
Yes, so the programs and the information that is available on our website is blackchurchfoodsecurity.net, and I can drop the information in the chat box. And what the programs that I mentioned, so for churches who are interested in partnering with us, we do have a couple of benefits of membership that we offer. One of the main things that we do is we offer each church up to $1,000 to start their project. And that $1,000 can act as seed funding. And we also have various trainings throughout the year to discuss about how to become self-sustaining beyond grants, to talk about how to efficiently operate a farmer's market, as well as we connect you to our network of Black farmers. So just in case you want to partner with farmers for the farmers market and you want to partner with them for your choir anniversary, your church anniversary, and your pastor's anniversary. So we have a long directory of Black farmers that we can connect you with as well. And all of that information is on our website.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. I appreciate you for sharing that. Doc Carroll, we're coming to you in a moment because we know that this is really just part 1 of a 2-part experience. And so we'll come to you to promote the next webinar. Next question, I would also like to know more about agritherapy. Doc Smith, Doc Henderson, can you point direction? I believe y'all raised that. Where can people go to study or learn more about agritherapy?
So you can go ahead, Dr. Henderson.
No, go ahead, Doc.
A couple of avenues in the network that we're working with Dr. Henderson's organization, the Center for Community Enrichment, and our Center for Food, Faith, and Justice. We can talk to you directly about agritherapy and send you some of that information. We will give that information so Sister Kim and Siobhan can get it out, but we would love to be in touch. And really agritherapy and agroecology are some fancy words for stuff that Siobhan has already lifted up that we already doing ancestrally. But we can talk to you about some of the particulars about what that means, about disassociating trauma or de-traumatizing folks, and some practices that you can put into play.
Awesome, awesome. Doc Smith and Brett Shepard just put in the chat box an email and would love to follow up with you on agritherapy. Thank you so much for sharing that. We got 10 minutes left. Y'all, when church is good, y'all know it go fast. Amen. We might, Sister Kim is holding the reins real tight. So this can't be like traditional Black church where we stay in the sanctuary for an hour after the service is over. She gonna make us get off this line. She just typed to me 9 minutes, Reverend Brown, 9 minutes. Praise the Lord. So we got 9 minutes. I need to give a couple of those minutes to you, Doc Carroll, to promote the afternoon. But Doc Kenny, there was a quick question we'd love for you to give a word to Oh, okay. And then we'll just quickly go around and share everybody's contact information. How can people stay in contact with you? But the word, Doc Kenny, discipleship. Discipleship. You raise that up. What should that look like? If you can give a quick word there before we close out.
I don't know if there's a quick word, but I approach discipleship is forming people for authentic faith. And if I'm forming people, then it means that I do have to have some suspicion about methods and models that have been designed to serve somebody other than the people I pastor.
Wow.
That's everything from literature to TV shows you're watching. But forming people for faith, first of all, means for me, it's doing honest Bible study and not just indoctrination. Creating space where people can see meaning that's deeper than just what you've been taught. The greatest threat to knowing God is to know God too well already. And you begin to build a shrine to what you know rather than the God that's in front of you and beyond you. There's so much more. We have just scratched the surface. If we would just reclaim our connection, and part of that connection is with God and with earth.
Lord, it's offering time. Listen, you can't get this kind of wisdom and then walk away without putting something in the basket. Dr. Kenny, how can people stay in touch with you or follow your work? How can they connect?
Best thing to do is just contact with J.W. Kenny at vuu.edu right now. We're even trying to set some things up through the church. But you can contact me by email. This is an intense time. We're trying to get grades in for the term and everything, but I will get back to folk and show them. I have a very brief article that I can give people. It's called Living Forgiving, that shows the shift that occurred when God told us to produce fruit, but we start taking fruit. Rather than producing it, we took it. And we have become a world of takers rather than producers and givers.
Woo, living for giving.
Yes.
I'm going to add that to the list. Y'all be blessed by that. And thank you for being so generous and sharing your email with us, Dr. Kenny. Reverend Austria, how can people connect more with you and the wonderful work you're doing? Can you give an infomercial about Kindred Seedlings Farm?
Yeah, no doubt. Kindred Seedlings Farm, reclaiming land, reclaiming food. You can connect with me on social media. I have an Instagram and a Facebook. I'll drop my email address into the chat box. I got a Zoom account, so we can Zoom if you need to do that. And right now we're just leaning into the growing season. And so we're just trying to be in the dirt as much as possible and do those things. So definitely can connect after this session. Thank y'all.
Oh, it's been amazing. Thank you so much, Reverend Austria. We appreciate you. How about you, Dr. Smith? How can people, what's the best way to stay connected with you?
Same way, they can connect the McGee Facebook page, and then they can do my personal email if they can get me directly. It's you can send it out, Doc, but it's frostmick1@aol.com. But they can connect me with me directly, and I will make sure we respond quickly.
Awesome. Doc Henderson.
Yes, sir. Try me at the Center for Community Enrichment, but use my name, Morris Henderson, at comcast.net. Morris Henderson at comcast.net. And right. Brother Heber.
Yes.
Virginia State, my brother.
Virginia State's in the house. Look at that.
I see you got Morgan State on. I'm gonna go with my agriculture folks today.
Now, every time we start talking about HBCUs, y'all know we start gangbanging up in here. So we ain't gonna do it. We're gonna start throwing up all the time.
Turning my mic off. I'm turning my mic off.
Amen. Sister Siobhan shared best way you shared the email. I mean the website. Email people want to follow up with you.
Yes. So you can add us on social media. On Facebook, it's Black Church Food Security Network. The entire name is our Facebook name. And on Instagram and Twitter, it's Black Church FSN. F as in food, S as in security, N as in network. And our email is info@blackchurchfoodsecurity.net. I always mess up. I'm sorry, y'all. But everything is on our website. So you can just head over to our website, www.blackchurchfoodsecurity.net.
Awesome, awesome. This has been profound. We really could have done this for hours longer than what we did. It was just a teaspoon, an introduction. The recording we made available at a later time as well. But Dr. Carroll, can you please give us a heads up and a word about what's coming in the next few hours as well?
Just real quick, if you all made it here, thank everyone for being out. This has been powerful. We will have our next event at 3 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, 6 o'clock Eastern. We're going to union on this notion of Black, Green, and Traumatized. We have individuals from the Nature's Conservancy, Reverend Floyd Tompkins, San Francisco Theological. We have Mr. Carl Anthony and Dr. Paloma Pavel. It's going to be a rich piece. Reverend Thomas Brad-Keen will be our guest as well. Listen, this is an enlistment. It is movement time. It is past due, and I believe that God is calling, and many of you on this call today are here not because you saw a flyer, because you heard something, but because God has been nudging on your heart and on your mind about your ministry when it comes to the environment and taking care of God's earth. God is calling, and what Green the Church wants to be found doing is helping and serving you to get in the game. So I want to say to you today that all this conversation, listen, your prayer ought to be, Lord, while on others thou art calling, please don't pass me by. I hear you saying, hear my hands, use my hands. Here's my voice, use my voice for the uplifting and building of the city of God. greenthechurch.org. You all come on and let's join the enlistment. Bless you.